Yes. Is it underway now?
Yeah.
This is the Oddfellows section. Not the greatest, but it's kind of neat. And this is, there's one here and there's one here, and this is the one I put in the will, put me in here. So if you want to get a picture, you're going to have to help me get up.
What was that song? Plant your now,
If you're
dig your
around
later.
the other side, you'd see the marker, so they'll know where it is, Buzz. If I thought I could get up, I'd just lie down there for a minute.
Don't do it, don't do it.
It looks so restful here. It's not so. I don't think I'll ever change it again, but it isn't as attractive as I thought it was. Oh, I think it's okay. I like it better in a ways than right along the road here. But that would have been handy for all the posters and all the cards and things. I could have the little vendor stands there when the tourist bus goes by. They'd be right there. They had just get off the bus and right back on.
This way to Bennett grave.
Yes, and then I'll have to arrange for somebody to empty the.
So they're gonna have little tours downtown Jacksonville. And...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And down at the base of the hill here, have little arrows pointing up. Gene's place. Cards, posters.
Get your plastic roses here.
Plastic roses. Well, maybe not.
Gene was from the other side of the tracks. In Medford, like a lot of small towns all over America in the West, there was an east side and a west side, or whatever it is in any city. Like in Portland, there was the one side of the river and the other side of the river. And it was not rare to Medford, I don't want that. But there was a difference. There were working people on this side and the better homes were on the other side. And even through the 30s, that existed in Medford. It was a clear line at the railroad tracks. And there was the east side and the west side. Gene was from the west side. I think he was always aware of it. I think he's aware of it today. It was a part of his psyche. Of course, that's also part of his triumph, because all the homes on the east side are the ones that collect his paintings.
Okay, well, you just say a little, because I already know what you're going to ask me.
Well, tell me a little bit about growing up in this area, when you were born and where, and a little bit about your family, structure of your family.
Well, I was born in Central Point, which is just north of Medford, and I was the youngest of 4 children. And I had 2 brothers and a sister, and the oldest brother and sister were twins. and then a brother just older than I, by about a year and a half or so. I don't really remember very much about Central Point, but we moved up to Medford, I think, when I was 3 or 4. And I really don't remember the early years in Medford, but I do recall some things in Prospect. We lived, maybe a mile or so this side of Prospect. My dad was up there with the construction crew from the power company. It was Copco at that time. I think that was my earliest experience of kind of living out in the woods, or being, you know, in really a rural thing, even more than that, because this was timber area, and we had a very rustic setting and all, and I really enjoyed it, and I think that probably had a lasting effect. It probably explains a lot of it. Well, when we moved back to Medford, then the earliest teacher that I recall having anything to do with art was Alice Cromar, and she probably was my favorite teacher in the early years, and also the one that really nourished my interest in art. And it was always really just kind of thrilling to me to even see either some paints out, or maybe crayons, or colored paper and scissors, and I mean, just the looks of the things was always, I think I must have really liked that ever since I can remember. Also, right along at that time was Sunday school. In those days, we had things to color, and you get points for neatness and all, you know, but you'd color these figures and settings that had to do with Bible stories, and then cut out these things and paste them up and make a picture, you know. I would say it's kind of the first experience with collage, probably. In high school, there was a very fine teacher. We only had her a year, but she had just studied the summer before with Maholy-Nagy in Chicago, and so she brought a lot of very avant-garde ideas, and I think we were really fortunate to have had that, you know, that experience, even though they fired her because she was too progressive for their taste here. You know, there was no art community at that time, but there were several friends that were interested in art, and so we had our own kind of small group, and we were all in these art classes together. And so there was some reinforcement there. And my family was really supportive. They were much more supportive maybe in music, because all of us played instruments and sang, and every time there was some sort of a gathering, it was really heard the community sing at home. But I feel that my mother was very supportive. Well, my parents were. My mother particularly, but my sister was very supportive, all up until the time she was gone, really. There were several outside influences, outside of school, that I really should mention along about this time, because I'd been taking violin lessons sometime earlier for 2.5 years or so, and then piano lessons, first with Fred Alton Haight. There was also an organist at the Criterion Theater, and he taught piano and organ in the pit of the Criterion Theater. It was a wonderful experience because it was a big theater organ, a Wurlitzer organ. But Don Huckabee was his name, and he used to play at the intermissions of the first and second shows, either in the afternoon or in the evening. And it was all very exciting, and I remember one time a recital at the Criterion, and they had several piano students playing on the stage at different times. And then I remember playing a duet he was on the organ, I was on the piano. And so that was...
I know that I think you had a brother that played basketball and
Yes.
a brother that played football, and you
Right.
played the piano.
Right.
That must have been a little hard.
Oh, it was. And of course, I don't think people could take art seriously, and music not all that seriously, although my family, I thought, was supportive in music, because all of us played or sang, or all of it, you know.
Oh, that was something.
My mother played the piano, and my sister played the piano, and my brothers took trumpet and saxophone, and we all sang. And
then you had music in common.
Oh yeah, and every time the family got together, we always had singing. Relatives, and we had lots of reunions. I never liked those very much, but I came from a family that seemed to want to have reunions. And it was wonderful. If you get 4 generations together, you'd think that that was the end of the world. And those are things that I never cared very much about, really. I think that probably the most important influence, though, during those high school years, or at least the latter, the junior and senior year perhaps, was John Reisacher. And John Reisacher was a piano teacher, but he was also a painter on his own. So I did take lessons from him, piano lessons, but as we got to know one another, he then invited me to go painting. We'd go out in the car and on field trips, and several of them up around the Ashland area, because he had been involved in Shakespeare every summer, and I suppose that's one of the reasons he knew the area. And I remember that very fondly because of the car radio, and on Sundays there was always a New York Philharmonic playing. And so we'd park the car and paint near the car and have the radio on. That really registered with me, and by that time I had a pretty good idea that I was going to go to the University of Oregon and be a music major. So it was a very nice summer, and part of that summer was spent in Shakespeare. It's the only time I ever had any experience, but the festival in Shakespeare was something that John Reisacher had speaking parts, I think, since he moved to Medford, whenever that was. But I had a small role in Much Ado About Nothing, which was kind of fun. It was enough to know that theater was not my thing. And I was doing some composing at that time, and I wrote a song that Bill Cottrell, who was the director that summer, he directed all 4 plays. He asked to use a song that I'd written in Much Ado About Nothing. It was just a small part of the play, and several things that I set to music by the Negro poet Langston Hughes. I really liked his poetry, and it was very easy to set to music, I thought. So those were all preliminary things before going on up to Eugene, but John Reisacher had taught me all the basics of oil painting and how to put out a palette, and an arrangement of colors, which is always the same, so you know just where everything is. And even today, I still use that same setup. He was a strong influence because he's the first person that talked about other painters outside of Southern Oregon. I mean, painters like Cezanne, and never did really see any original Cezannes until much later when I went to Chicago. So in the fall of 1940, I went up to Oregon, in Eugene, University of Oregon, and really wanted to major, and did major, in music. So I think I really wanted to be a composer and maybe a musician. But when I got up there, I realized more and more as the time went along that I wasn't going to be able to accomplish what I really wanted to in music. I didn't think I had it. I didn't get the discipline, or didn't start early enough. And I still was painting occasionally up there. We'd go out sketching or painting, but it was never a classroom sort of thing. Undoubtedly, the most significant thing that occurred during those 3 years at Oregon was the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And that changed everything. Not only there, it changed everyone's lives. And as I look back on it now, I realize that was a major change. I mean, it was going to be a major change for me because I enlisted in the Navy and could stay on in school until the summer of '43. But things were very different then, because a number of students had already enlisted and had gone off to either the Air Corps or, well, one of the services, Army, Navy, whatever. And you didn't have the good times, or the kind of carefree times, really, that usually is kind of associated with college life, because the war was going on, and that affected everything. Even, I remember the blackouts that they had in Eugene, and of course they had them all over the coast, but along the coastline. But even that in itself changed everything, because it was very kind of gloomy and dark every night. You didn't have all these lights on. And I remember it was sort of a don't care attitude with a number of us, because we didn't know what was ahead, whether we'd even be back at school, whether we'd even be out of the war. I mean, who was going to be coming back and who wouldn't? And there are all these things that you'd never think of. I never think of now, but I remember when those thoughts started creeping in, because it was obvious it was going to happen. Sometime during the following year after I enlisted in the Navy, that they had what they called a Pearl Harbor Avenger Day in Medford, and I remember we had to report down to the depot in Medford. There was a platform there. We weren't going anyplace, but they wanted to have a ceremony showing the various fellows from the area here who had enlisted in the Navy. I know my parents were there, and I handed down something that they had given us to my mother. But actually it was sometime after that, maybe even as much as 2 years, that I went into the Navy. I was called, I think the 1st of July in 1943, to go to Parkville, Missouri, which didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know where it was. And I took off for Missouri, and it turned out to be a place just out of Kansas City. And I met a very influential person on my life anyway, and in art, because we were able to take one elective that summer. So I enrolled in this class in art with John Totchell, who was an alien, and German alien, and he was working in the Midwest because he couldn't find a position on the East Coast. In any case, he was there, a really kind of a fortunate thing, because he was very qualified, more than would be for any other school. So I spent the summer in that art class, and really was influenced greatly by his interest and appreciation of art and music. I remember that he introduced us to various European painters that so far I hadn't heard of, other than Cezanne and a few others, but he also brought us up to date in showing us reproductions by artists such as Picasso and Braque. And there's a painting done at that time, and it's very obviously things from the things that Picasso and Braque were doing even together, and Cubist work. But he had us experiment with all those kinds of things, and also a way of approaching it, which was quite easy, was to design some stage sets, very abstract stage sets. And at the end of that course, we had an art exhibit. First time that I realized the kind of fun things that you would have. I mean, this big table of all kinds of food and work that everybody in the class had done. I mean, everybody had some things up, and it was just a really neat thing. It's something I hadn't ever experienced before. In March of 1945, I got orders to go over to Hawaii. That we landed on Oahu, and we were stationed at John Rogers Field, which is just out of Honolulu. And I remember that when we got off the plane, it just seemed so balmy and nice. I couldn't believe that, that kind of weather. So I was stationed over there for a little over a year, and during that time, there was lots of opportunity to paint, and still with watercolor. And I had all kinds of materials that I had picked up along the way in the way of papers and brushes and so forth. And over that period of time, I did just many watercolors. And at the end of, after you've been stationed over there for a year, you had the opportunity of having a 5-day leave. We went to Maui and then on down to Hilo, Hawaii. And of course I took painting things along with me. Different kinds of settings, unbelievable color. The blues and greens were so intense, they just looked artificial when you'd paint them, but I just painted as I saw it. And there were many of those. In fact, with watercolor, they do go so rapidly that they just stacked up. So I had a lot of work when I finally got ready to come back from that stay. During the time I was in Hawaii, I had word that my mother was really ill, and she hadn't said very much on that little leave that I had before I went overseas. It turned out, after they had all these exams and everything, that she had cancer, and it was very far along. And we had word that from the doctor that I should come home, and so I went to see the CO, and they wouldn't let me come back because there were other family members there. And at that time, during wartime, I guess, if somebody from the family's there, not everybody has to be. I mean, you're not released from the service to go there. And then some more messages came, and it said, the doctor even sent a thing saying that if I was going to see her alive, I would have to come right away. And he still wouldn't do it. And then I did call home a couple of times, but my mother wasn't even able to get to a phone or anything. That's how I knew it was really bad. So my dad had an extension put in, and so I talked to her, and not more than a week later, she was gone. And then I went to see if I could go home for the funeral, and the commanding officer said that, well, it wouldn't make any sense now because she's gone, So it was really a very bitter kind of thing. And that happened on July 1st of 45, and I didn't get home until the next year. And by that time, everybody in the family and friends and all that had adjusted to that vacuum. But to me, that's when it would finally hit home. And that was really a bitter kind of thing, because they wouldn't let me go. And at the same time, they were letting officers spend the weekend in San Francisco, flying back and forth. See, we always had planes going to and from every day. It wasn't like you were out on a ship someplace or something. Then when I did get home, it was as if it had just happened, because I had been in another setting. I didn't get the impact until I was actually here. And then my dad had been going with somebody and was going to get married, and that didn't help. I mean, it's just... So I think that I know that there was a big change in my life, and because it wasn't just my mother, but it was that the family just sort of disintegrated then. Everybody, she was the thing that sort of held it all together, and I think that happens often in families. After a short leave in Medford, I went up to Bremerton to get out of it, and was discharged there, and then back down to Medford, and I immediately started in. I had decided by this time, although I'd been thinking about it off and on for months, that I would really switch majors. And even though my dad and and friends thought I would naturally go back to Oregon, I only had about 12 hours left to get my degree. But I really didn't want to go back at all, not to spend another day up there, really. So I started writing to different places. I applied at the Portland Art Museum School, and a good school in San Francisco, and one in Oakland. And also I thought, just for the heck of it, I would even try the Art Institute of Chicago. And before long, had a letter back saying that I was accepted, but because there were so many veterans going to school at that time, that because the war just ended, in August. And so I thought it'd be worth it to wait. I remember that's when I spent really quite a bit of time. Every once in a while I'd be over here in this cemetery. And I started doing sketches and so on, even up there, from the kind of ornate fences and so forth. But the thing that I really noticed was that maybe because I had lost about more than 3 years of time being in the Navy and kind of getting older all the time, I decided I just seemed to have to accelerate and keep busy all the time. That may have been my way of handling it. And I remember I started really working all the time, And since my dad was going to remarry, I got the vacant lot, which was next door to our house. And there was an old workshop on that, and so I decided while I was waiting to get into Chicago, I had a year, a school year. So I spent the time working on that building, fixing it up as a place to live, because I wouldn't want to be living with anybody else. And at the same time, I worked half days with a music store, which I'd done occasionally. But I worked afternoons at the music store and in the mornings on this building. This might be kind of interesting from the back here. That was put in after he had designed it as a studio.
Well, and you could see the similarities with all the places.
Yeah.
How they're all like the single architect put them all together.
Right.
Yeah.
They were great, but you know, I'm getting along enough so that I can't keep up with everything, and besides, I'm pretty busy with my own thing over there now.
Plenty
you know.
to do.
Yeah, I've been
Sure.
over there 36 years, so you know,
Oh.
this is.
This is real old history for you.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But a lot of fond memories of
Oh,
it
I
all.
can imagine.
And I've had a lot of good tenants over the years
Mhm.
in all of these places. I mean, some not so good at one time, but most a lot of nice memories. These were the timbers that I put in under that one that's gone now.
Oh,
They probably saved these because they're. I'll be darned. You
Huh.
know, it's funny, but that's. I'm glad you're with me. You'd think I'd be in tears now. My old
your old place
home
is
is gone. And the places in Central Point, you know, the two family homes, the Pearts and Bennetts, they're both gone. Well, it's all right. But that's, I'm glad they're doing what they're going to do what they're doing. So in the fall of 1947 is when I went to Chicago. That's after that waiting period. And it was really terrific. I mean, I knew that this was the right place to be because I liked everything that I was taking. I mean, whether it was life drawing or general drawing or design, even art history was really neat, particularly because the woman that taught that, Kathleen Blackshear, actually was almost better than a teacher in the lab classes because our assignments in art history were not writing papers and so on, but to do various kinds of things in the style of. I remember doing something like do a self-portrait in the style of a Japanese print, or in the style of Renoir, or in the style of Cézanne, or in the style of Picasso. So that in order to do something like that, you'd have to look at these various artists and see how they worked. I mean, it was a way of learning. You'd have to look at them because you're going to have to render something in the style that they worked in. It was really a very good approach, and she was a marvelous teacher. I took 3 years of art history. Also, she had a Saturday class in composition criticism, which was another very stimulating thing and very helpful, and developed a lot of ideas for painting, you know, far more than just, well, all of it was important, but, you know, in a painting class or a drawing class, you would draw on charcoal. In fact, that's all we did in general drawing the first year, up until just a few weeks at the end of the school year in the spring. And we would go outside the school along Grant Park, along Michigan Boulevard, and work outside. And so the whole thing together seemed to me, like especially the first year, was an excellent first year course for anyone because it was so well balanced. And then there were opportunities to, if you were working on some particular project, the school at that time was in the basement of the Art Institute, and you're always free to go up into the galleries, you know. And so if you're working on some particular thing, and I remember when I was so interested in portrait painting in 1950 and 51 and through there, if I'd work on something and then go up and look around in the gallery and see how Van Gogh painted a portrait and what colors, and I remember looking to see how he treated the eyes and so on, and you had a reference there of not reproductions, but I mean you had fine art to look at, doing the same kinds of things that you were working on. I mean, that would answer a lot of things that you might wonder about. So it was really an ideal situation. And I really enjoyed the time. And then when it was time to come back for the summer, I mean, after the first year, I would usually come back out here. And the first year I came home, I remember Leonard Carpenter, who was a brother of Alfred Carpenter, and he said, well, why don't you have some classes? And I said, well, I don't know whether I'd even know how to teach. And he said, well, just teach us what they taught you. And that's what I did. And I think the first year there might have been about 8 or 10 people that took. And we would go to various places. I didn't have a place to do that. So we just had field classes. We would go to some area twice a week, and we would have the morning from 9 to 12. the last half hour being time for a critique of whatever they'd done that day. And so we went to various places in the valley, and I would schedule ahead so they would know where we were going to meet. They wouldn't have to come to my place, we'd go directly to whatever. And then at the end of the summer, we had a little art exhibit of everybody in the class had at least, it was either one or two things in the show. Anyway, the second year, there were, I think, maybe about 20, 25 people. Well, part of them were children. I started having children's classes on Saturday mornings. And I hadn't done that the first year. So it kept building, and every year I'd come out and do that. And then after the classes were over, I'd build another little building on that property before going back and get as far as I could with it, and then finish it up the next year and probably build another. So that was kind of the pattern during that time, the first 4 years at school. Only it got more elaborate with more involved in a way with the classes. They became bigger and bigger, and finally I had, about the end of the time I was teaching, there were around 65 people in different classes.
It must have been an intense, fun period.
It was a good time for art school because with all the veterans, they were more serious, they were older. Our training was sort of more School of Paris than anything else, because about the time we were finishing up, abstract expressionism was starting, and we were out of that loop. We weren't part of that at all.
Mm-hmm. When you were both in school, who was the rage? Who was the most popular? If not one artist, what was the most popular style?
The styles from the 30s and 40s were still kind of hanging on then, because, like I said, the abstract expressionist thing was kind of starting about then. And before that came along, the two main things was kind of American regional painting, and the other thing would have been surrealism. They were sort of the two main directions, I think. So all the people you used to see in Life magazine back then, they got the attention.
Who were some of those people?
Oh, it would have been people like Thomas Hart Benton and Curry and Grant Wood. So,
Kind of a social realism.
I would say it was predominantly a kind of realism, and then some surrealism too. Abstract expressionism, I think, developed out of surrealism. Personally, we would go to exhibits and see what the galleries were showing and all. And there were a group of Chicago artists who were abstract. I'd say their work was kind of a decorative abstract style. And I think at that point, while we were in school, in my case anyway, mostly influenced by the teachers and what they wanted. And I think maybe Gene too. So we had a kind of strict, I wouldn't want to say conventional exactly, but we had a very thorough training in all the basic part of art.
So your teachers were a direct influence.
Oh, sure.
You think that's typical?
Picasso said artists have to have parents. We took a history of Japanese prints, and we took a course called composition criticism, and that was taught by a woman named Kathleen Blackshear, she was the most modern minded teacher in the place. She was very much taken with primitive art and African art and Aborigine art from Australia and things like that.
Of all the people we studied with, I thought Kathleen Blackshear brought more things out, made you think, actually gave you exercises to do, and I found it more valuable than like the painting or drawing teachers, in a way, even over them.
What about that teacher with the Prince Valiant haircut?
Oh, Boris Anisfeld.
Right.
He was Russian. He came over with Diaghilev. Gene studied still life painting and figure painting with him. I had him for still life painting. And I think in a whole year he said maybe 4 things to me. One thing he said was, you have to struggle. There used to be a movie house on the west side of Chicago that showed Russian movies, and he would go to those. And I would go too. And back then, it was Cold War, and I always had the feeling that when you came out of the theater, they were taking pictures of the FBI from across the street. I don't know if they did or not.
I was with Anisfeld the second year, and you went right to Weigart. And maybe that's why it was not so easy with me with Weigard, because they were very different.
The thing is, Annisfeld lived a long time, and Weigard died, I would guess maybe in the 60s or so. But in later years, Annisfeld received attention that he didn't get even while he was teaching. I think Andy Warhol used one of his paintings in the Interview magazine on the front one time.
But actually, I think really Weigard was more of a dedicated teacher. I mean, he just, when he saw something that you were doing, we did very many things on paper as kind of a start for different poses and things before we settled in and did a canvas of some pose. And when he would see some of these things he liked, he would take them and mount them for you. I mean, you know, it was kind of really neat. He did a lot of that and gave those things to you when it was over, you know.
And every 2 weeks, all the work the students did would be put up together, and he would discuss things and get the class to say what they thought.
Right.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. Oh, he really worked at it. By the third year, I served as the president of the Art Students League. And so there were activities involving that. I mean, we would have exhibits. We'd have one at the school at Blackstone Hall, but we had shows other places around Chicago in the vicinity. And I started being much more active in exhibits, starting to show work and all. And there were veterans shows. I can't remember all the shows, but the one that really stands out, a couple of shows really, were at the Museum of Modern Art. And they had sent out announcements to prospectus for shows that they were having. One of them was a young printmakers show. And I sent in some 2 or 3 serigraphs that I'd done, silkscreen prints. And one of them was accepted, segments. They sold about, I think, 4 or 5 copies, but they bought one of them for the museum collection, and they sent that on a tour in Europe. And then they borrowed one to send on a show that was traveling throughout the country here. And that was probably the highlight. The last year at the Art Institute, one of the classes I took was in weaving, and we had to work out patterns and so on graph paper. And it looked so much, it reminded me a lot of some artists. I'd been admiring Paul Klee for several years actually, and also Mondrian. And these things on graph paper, to me, looked somewhat like cities, because finally I was flying to and from Chicago instead of taking the train out of Medford. And having flown quite a bit more, I started using ideas from the air, and I even did paintings, rural things even. Be like landscapes, only from up above rather than looking across. So I think the weaving things really contributed a lot to what I was doing then, even in silkscreen, where you would cut stencils and so on. Went back for the 4th year at the Art Institute, and having been in art education, that was the year, the 4th year, would be to decide where to go for practice teaching. And there had been a good Life magazine article about New Trier High School as a very outstanding school in the country. So I applied to do it there and did get to practice teach there, and enjoyed the school and also liked teaching. And at the end of that school year, one of the teachers that had been there for years was taking a sabbatical so he could go out to Stanford. So they offered me that position full-time, so I taught at New Trier for a school year. And then when he came back, they wondered if I would come and teach half days, and then I could start working on my master's degree, the other half. When I finished my master's degree, I had been hoping to go to Italy or France, and I decided just to take off a year, and I said I really would like to have a leave of absence so I could go over there and just work on my own for a while. So they did give me a leave of absence, and that fall of 1954, I sailed over to France on the Ile-de-France, and spent about, I think, 5 or 6 weeks going through France on the way to Italy. And probably the highlight of all the things I did in France and almost in a whole year was spending the time in Chartres and in the cathedral there. And I've done paintings from inside and outside, the influence of the stained glass window. And already had names of places in Florence and other places that students, friends that had already been over there. They always passed the word along of places to stay, really inexpensive places and so on. So I knew where I was headed if I could get a room at this pensione in Florence. But when I got there, it was late in the day, and so I just stayed overnight, that first night, in a pensione near the railroad station. And I remember walking, I couldn't wait until daylight, so I walked out and around. I wanted to see the Duomo and all these things that I had looked at, studied in art history and had seen pictures of them. The next day, I went over to locate the Pensione Bartolini, as address I had, and it was right along the Arno River. And got a room there, fortunately, and overlooking the Arno. I had a room that had these big windows, and you pull the windows would open, so you were almost outside, you know. And it was very simple, and it didn't have central heating, and in fact it had a kind of a metal barrel where you could burn wood. You'd have to do that in the wintertime. But it was fine and very inexpensive, and it was equivalent to about $2.65 a day, actually. So I just kept that room all year. All the time I was in Italy. Even the times when I would go away, either up to Venice or down into Sicily, wherever, I always kept that room by the week and kept all the paints, all the oils, everything there. And when I come back, I would work on things and do sketches and take pictures, photographs while I was traveling.
And the Bartolonis, was right on the Arno River.
Right,
I remember taking a picture from the doorstep
Oh,
of
yeah.
the Arno
Yeah.
to remind you of what you had seen.
Well,
for
I
so
could look
long.
right down on the river, from the fourth floor. The other thing I thought was pretty interesting, and I may have told you all about that before, but I was a music major, before going into art, and so I'd always had a piano wherever, and to be in Florence for a school year without a piano seemed kind of too bad. I went around and asked what it would be to rent one, and it was so reasonable. But the thing that amazed me was that they carried that piano up those stairs, four
to the
flights.
fourth floor
Yeah,
for you.
there were, I think, 5 men who, would carry that thing up, and we put it in my room, and that was really good because for the rest of the year, once in a while, I would have a musical, and I would sort of announce it in the dining room, with a smaller group or whatever. Mm-hmm. But there'd be people from all over.
What fun! What a wonderful
Yeah.
way to get acquainted in the
But
neighborhood.
Germans and French and, different languages. And it turned out that a song that really would everybody could sort of join in was Old MacDonald Had a Farm, really a classic.
In everyone's own, in everybody's own language.
I don't know
Love
whether they knew what we were singing or what, but.
What I wanted to ask you about was that your most splendid year of painting, more opportunity, more.
It's probably the most productive. I think I brought back about 85 paintings, plus a whole trunk full of things on paper or bits and pieces of things for collages. Because the kids would always as soon as they'd put up these posters around on bulletin boards, on fences or walls, more like walls, really. But they always did. It was an interesting thing to put one after another. There might be 20 or 30 of the same poster, one right after the other. And by evening, when it started to get dark, the kids would already be tearing the things off. I don't know why they did it, but so I joined in on some of the pieces.
Went around tearing things off?
When I got ready to come back a year later, school year later, I filled up the one trunk. I had a little space at the top, so I filled in I didn't want to leave all these pieces of collage, of bullet boards. I'd fill up the trunk with those. And then I worried because you do all this and then they seal everything, and then when you get to customs in New York, you don't know who they're going to inspect.
And you felt you had artifacts.
Well, I thought, no, it's more serious than that. I thought they think I needed to be in a home someplace right away.
Oh, for
to
having
open a
taken
trunk.
off all the posters.
Well, to see the top of the trunk, you might
Oh, I
think the
think
whole
that-
thing was full of these pieces of paper and all, torn off of just scraps.
Off of fences. I like that.
I still have those things at home. Can you get some of that? I meant to have this as really kind of to show a Tuscan palette, but and very abstract. And I did many things. See, these are quite small things, but all that would have to be, if you're bringing it back, you have to have all that sealed in packages. Even before I went to Italy, I'd had shows at Mandel Brothers Galleries in Chicago. Before I went away, they said that I could have a one-man show there when I got back. So I knew before I ever went over there that there was going to be an opportunity to have a show. So I spent a lot of time as soon as I got back framing all these things, stretching the canvases and then framing them. And that show, that was a big show from all the work of all the work that I did over there. I think that school year in Florence and traveling here and there from Florence to work was probably the highlight of, I think, the best time period of my life. And so when I got back, I taught again at New Trier, and I had decided that I was probably going to come back out here, but it was very difficult to really make a decision to leave. But the nice thing about it was that if I would do that, then I would have time to work. So I moved back to Medford, and I remember when I got back, I went over by my brother's house on Haven Street, and they were having a big picnic out in the backyard. And I was sort of bleary-eyed after driving 4 days, or maybe it was 5 days on that trip out here. But I stayed over there for a while in the afternoon, and the place I was staying on Grape Street was one of the apartments that was still not completed, really. I mean, it had plumbing and all that, but there were things that weren't really finished there, so I sort of roughed it for a while. And I had a lot of stuff coming in the moving van, which got there a couple days later. And there was no place to put it all, so we put it out on the patio. The rains would come once in a while, and that's probably why I bought the house. And that meant I was going to be here, I thought I would move back out here, get everything sort of put someplace, and then maybe go to San Francisco or up north. I didn't know I was going to really stay here in this one location. And I did that, and I stayed there for 3 or 4 years before moving to Jacksonville. I thought, finally, either go back to some city or else get further out to more of a rural area. And I'd always liked Jacksonville, so this seemed like a logical place. And I pursued this property. I asked the people next door and went to see the people that owned this, and they didn't want to sell it. I just wanted a little bit of it, but they didn't want to have it surveyed or anything. And I kept bugging them and finally said, well, if you take the whole thing, we'll sell it to you. But it looked so doubtful at first with them because they were just adamant that it wasn't for sale. So then I started talking to a lady that owns that house over across the way. I was just buying the house, and the people said that they would sell this. And property was so inexpensive here that I decided I'll just do both. I'll get both of them, and I did. Nice open can. I don't know whether it's purring. Are you purring today? Your machine got the motor shut off. Can you hear it? Yes. It even kind of does that when I feed it. It's, I don't know how it can purr and eat at the same time, but it seems to do it.
Do you feel now, all these years later, that it was a good decision to come west and stay west? Had you stayed in Chicago, what would have been different in your life?
It took 2 years before I did it, but
Made the decision.
Yeah, it really was hard to leave something that was very definite. And I had tenure for teaching. I liked teaching, but I wasn't able to do much of anything because if you're teaching 5 days a week, and then you have some evening things, in connection with school teaching.
And then naturally there are things to do on the weekends and getting the laundry done and any of these, and shopping and all the rest. I didn't have really much time, and I couldn't see that that was ever going to be any different.
At first, I thought when he came back that maybe it was a mistake because he was doing so well, and to leave that's quite a leap of faith.
I believe it was based primarily on where he felt that he could do his art the best. I think that there were parents here, or a parent at that time, and they later passed away. But I think Gene, first of all, was coming back here to take care of family.
I remember the years that you had to fill the station wagon with paintings every spring and go to Chicago and sell everything.
Yeah.
And then come home. And you were giving up a ready market for your art,
Oh,
and
yeah.
an audience for it that knew you and valued you. That must have been a little hard to walk away from.
Well, it's true, and I probably was a little selfish about that because I sort of believe that we only go around once, and I thought that it was important to me, and I really thought about this a lot. Career-wise, it was not a very good idea to move back out here.
No, I don't think Gene was obsessed with recognition and fame. But I'm certain that there must have been that debate, whether or not to go forward with his recognition in Chicago and where that might have led. Chicago being, at that time, probably the second most important art place in the United States.
I thought about all those things a lot. Like I say, it really took about
Why
2
do you
years.
say that was selfish? I think it was courageous to leave a known...
Well, I think it was selfish in that I felt that I wanted this kind of an environment and I wanted this kind of life, whereas a lot of people had spent time with me, teaching me, and they'd invested in me, things that they knew, I mean, did the best they could in teaching me, and then I up and leave and come out to enjoy life in a setting.
Oh, but what you did ultimately was bring what they had taught you to an area that needed you more.
I have an idea that most of us in our early years hope for recognition. And then if we start to get it, it's just like having to be careful what you hope for. And if you start to get the recognition, then you're faced with what does this really mean? And what does it really mean about your art?
This is what I thought I wanted to do, and I know I probably would have gone so much further. My career would have been very different than it's been.
But he left a very successful career to do it.
You have to remember, Medford was a very remarkable community. It was not like Grants Pass, not like Roseburg, not like Eugene. We was an orchard country. Then there was a core of the railroad merchant core down, ringed around the valley were these orchard people who had come mostly from Chicago and Boston, because this was the area that the railroad had sold to in those particular cities. They were people who went to operas, they went to the big social balls. They were part of society. And they were second sons or third sons who came west and to make their living in the orchard business, which was considered a very respectable, distinguished. It was like the orange groves in Southern California, the lemon groves. It was all, the Southern Pacific Railroad was selling the West and to upmarket people. And though for some time, they were always separated from the community. There was a town and gown sort of a thing that happened, and they had a university club in town, and they had a women's club where they could go and change clothes if there was a party, or so they had a different social life, but it never was arrogant and it never was artificial in that sense. But it created a kind of a community that had a tone, that had some class, and there was a civilized air about what happened in Medford. And that, you could go off in other directions. That is reflected, I think, in in the development of Shakespeare here, in the development of the Brit thing. There were people who wanted good things to happen in the community, and they were willing to support it. So Medford was quite special, I think, at that time. And Gene was one more reflection of that kind of a total environment that existed in the Rogue Valley, and they could recognize Gene as deserving.
This would be like the 40s and 50s and 60s.
40s and 50s and 60s. And those people, they had come much earlier. They came before World War I, and a lot of them went broke. And this valley was terribly poor through the 30s. They were poor too. Every one of them was in hock to the bank practically. And it was not a super rich or a jazz age world here, but they were people of education and people of manners. And through thick and thin, they survived, but they extended those manners into the community. And they set a tone and a style. And Gene was one more of the kinds of things that happened because of their very enlightened help.
Everybody who is a creative artist lives in a different world because you see things differently.
I think each artist has his own kind of personal sense of order, and he puts things together the way he wants to. And I think that, in a way, that's what talent is. You know, musicians do it with sounds, and so each person has his own way of seeing things.
Well, Gene has probably certainly he's had more general fine art influence than any of the other painters or artists in the area. You're aware of each brushstroke that he puts down, and each brushstroke goes in a very positive and interesting, I suppose you'd say, sort of way. He's also been quite inventive. First of all, his experimentations with drip line. Some of it is drawn and applied, and some of it is happenstance. Guided, I would guess. I think that he probably influences where the drips go. A magnificent colorist. The season really dominates. It leads him into interesting color selections, and his colors are always clean and fresh and vibrant. And then on his abstracts, he frequently works with a brilliant color and interrelating colors so that they have an exciting resonance. I think some of the most exquisite pieces of Gene's come close to being miniature works, really, just full of imagination and light humor, and that reads through his work beautifully. I do have some vague recollection of works that Gene was doing back in Chicago. The work was, that I recall, was mostly of Chicago scenes, buildings in the browns and grays, not nearly as lively as later Rogue Valley works turned out to be.
And yet he's kept that interesting sort of grid pattern that I think comes from having worked in Chicago and in the city and with skyscrapers, where there's a grid underneath the garden paintings or a grid underneath the landscapes that's barely visible. But that's one of the beautiful things about living with his paintings, is that you begin to see something new every time you look at it, and it has a lot of depth and dimension in that way.
I don't know whether he was doing line drawing with brush, and he was doing it at an easel so that the canvas was relatively vertical, and it started to run on him, and he said, "Wow, look at the exciting qualities of that," and permitted it to run, and perhaps tipped the canvas and got it running in various directions and started playing with it. A lot of art is playing. you see the potential if you permit yourself to enter into it and not just bring predisposition to it, but see what it wants to suggest. And I've got an idea that he just started to play with brush drawing and started to capitalize on the runs. And then the next thing would be to select little areas and start to find composition with color applied, perhaps within this framework, the skeletal framework that was there. And then perhaps, I would think it probably would start in the abstract, and maybe it evolved into a more representational.
And I think that that's true of most artists, is wherever you live, that's reflected in your artwork for certain.
The clarity of color, I think, is directly attributable to Southern Oregon light, to the environment. His decision to paint nature rather than the buildings of Chicago or the buildings of any other city or the urban experience, you could almost see that debate between the rural landscape painter or the urban painter taking place in Gene's mind. Southern Oregon light is bright and fresh and colorful. The gray moments come and go with quickness. You know, it's there's a dynamism in weather there. It may be very dark at a moment, but that doesn't last. It's followed by bright light again. The cleanness of color. I don't find a muddy sense at all. I don't find a gray tone. If there are gray tones, they're lively grays, which there are considerable differences in grays that way. There are lifeless grays, and there are grays that are infused, subtly infused with the warmth of yellows and reds and oranges, and grays that are infused with the coolness of blues. And incidentally, there are very few grays in Gene's paintings. I think his autumn landscapes are probably the most subdued, and yet they're full of vital light and color. And in the way he treats his skies, frequently it's exciting hits and moments of sky coming through tree leaves and structures like that. And they're very pure, clear, bright blues, turquoise blues, hits of that exciting color and light through there. His autumn colors, although they go to the autumn tones and the browns, they really are made of the brighter oranges and reds and purples and that sort of, you know, always aware of the vibrance, the liveliness of color. I would be inclined to say that about all of Gene's work, and that is that there's always a vitality, an energy. In his very intricate little pieces, they're usually made of many little parts in delicate relationship to many other little parts, and when they're very, very refined, still the refined elements have a dynamic. And incidentally, that's kind of a tough thing when you get into very refined things. Quite frequently, the refined becomes static, and Gene does it in an energized, dynamic sort of way.
I think there are things we all like more or less about different things he's done. I loved all the flower things, but I think the flower things everybody liked because he liked them. You know, if the flowers weren't expressing abstract art ideas, they were expressing enthusiasm, and that did show in his work. the big landscapes, like those that are big, long landscapes and distant things, I think they show an enthusiasm too. It's not that he cut and framed and found the right picture to paint. It's that he, and not that he puts you in that picture, but he puts himself in it, and he tells you, it seems to have a life that comes out of his interest in the painting.
One of the things that perhaps, well, others might not notice in the way that I would, or something, is that Gene has rather very, very fine architectural capabilities. He's put together some very beautiful and very exciting spaces, both in Grape Street and Medford when he was there initially, and then when he moved to Jacksonville, his gallery there, and with his additions and all, were very, very beautifully done. His sculpture also, which is not always known, is very, very handsome stuff. Yeah, I don't really know the origins of those poles. I don't know if that was an absolutely original Eugene Bennett concept, or whether he saw something like that and made his own contributions to that. But
you know, it actually came from the Jacksonville Cemetery. Some of those.
Oh, is that the? Oh, those are the origins.
That's one of the major.
Okay. He was basically approaching those poles initially, I mean, as I recall, with chainsaw and hammer and nails, and then he very carefully selected the nails that would go into it.
You were responsible for getting those poles into
The Oregon Pavilion at the Seattle World's Fair. Yeah, I was the architect for that, and I approached it from the point of view of selling the qualities that are Oregon, and so I tried to do a sort of a poetic interpretation, architectural interpretation of what I felt the state of Oregon was. At that time, Gene was doing these very, he was just new into it, I believe, and doing these very exciting poles. And so I had one of the poles in the interior pool and 3 or 4 poles on the outside in the landscape. They felt very Oregon to me, like they could only come out of Oregon or Washington. And so I think that they were a very nice addition to the Oregon Pavilion, and got some very, very fortunate attention. He's really an artist's artist. Most of what, if not everything I've ever seen him approach has come off with just a real commendable artistry. I find his little works and his large works are always a kind of intriguing puzzle, something that my eye wants to engage with. And I enjoy trying to follow Gene's mind and eye through the whole experience as he's laid it out. And I think that that's probably the finest thing that you can say about an artist, is that he intrigues your artistic sense.
I think most introverts have probably fewer friends than extroverts, but know them on a rather deeper level.
He's a loner, and I think that word, I use it kindly, because he solved his own financial problems. He was the one who did his own show schedules and the teaching schedule. He handled his own money. He didn't have a gallery manager or a gallery operator up in Portland or in San Francisco who handled his work. And that was particularly interesting because in the period that he was emerging as an artist in Oregon was the time that the galleries were emerging. And they were developing private galleries. Arlene Schnitzer and the different galleries finally moved up into being big-time art galleries, private art galleries. And Gene was never a part of that. He didn't try to get in there. He didn't want to for various reasons. Nobody tried to tell Gene what would sell. He wouldn't have listened anyway. And he survived almost outside of the professional art world development in the post-war era in Oregon. And that's what I mean, come back. He was a loner. He was probably a loner in the valley of Medford, here. We all knew him, but he was not intensely social. He was a very good guest, he entertained himself, but he was always private and a little bit reserved. And it was not that he was arty or he couldn't fit into things. He just was his own man. And he was a little bit more serious than all the rest of us, and a little bit more focused than all the rest of us at that time.
Does that show up?
Yeah.
You see what this is? This is all the tacks, the whole thing, and then nails on the side that sort of repeat some of those shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good on three sides. The back, it would have to be fairly close to the wall because it wouldn't be interesting from the back. And
Do
there's
little
some,
models with those things, sort of? Those blocks?
yeah, it could be.
Get an idea for the nail arrangement and things?
Yeah, right, exactly. See in there, I don't know whether you want, you can see I haven't really looked at those for quite a while. But there were different ideas. And I'm sure there's some other things there, and smaller things, and then samples of just ideas, you know, but just a part of a pole, like some of these things down in here. This is one where there were several things. It wouldn't have all of those, but different ideas with, and I used that on another pole, and some things like this, you know. This sort of led to some of those others, but and the weather's done something. I mean, this looks like it's mildew or something. I can't tell. But if I could only use one, there's this, and that with the tacks. Oh, and the other one was in the front room, but that's the very first one I ever did, and I want to keep that for a while.
When we first moved to the Valley, I realized that Eugene Bennett was the artist that everybody kind of held in awe, and I had met him, but I really hadn't gotten to know him. And then when we started putting the Artist in Education program together, the Rogue Gallery had a group of women that wanted to start this program, and I was working as the art curriculum specialist for Medford schools. So we put together a list of people for this program. And the first year it went very smoothly, and then I realized that Gene was very hurt that I hadn't included him. And I hadn't included him because I just had such great respect for him. I sort of held him in awe, and I thought he was a little above that. So when I found out that he was a little hurt about that, I included him the next year, and of course everybody wanted him to come to their school.
I'm surprised the number of young people who say they took a painting class from Eugene Bennett. That was a world I never saw, whether the young people were signed up or not.
He was so gracious about it. He was just wonderful with all the teachers and the kids, and we had a really great program thanks to him. What he did was used his brush technique, and it gave the children an opportunity to paint with oil paint, which they wouldn't in the normal school setting. So that was very special. And a lot of the kids did just really wonderful little landscapes, sort of following what he had done. I remember one little kid said, do I have to go to lunch? I'm not ready to go to lunch. Now that I can finally paint as good as Mr. Bennett, I don't want to stop.
2 consecutive summers, I took Gene's painting courses, and first met, he was a grand teacher. I mean, he was, first of all, it was very easy, and we're not talking highly structured approach to painting. He was very permissive, individually permissive.
So he had a lot of different classes who represented different segments of the community. And they meant a lot to him. The income meant a lot to him. So he was serious about them, but he was flexible enough not to be academic and demanding. He wanted us all to have a good time and have fun and also learn to paint.
See, when I was teaching, I really would try to get people to really get what they want in the way of a color, and whether light or dark, or lighter or dark or whatever, get it as close as you can to what you want. Don't just mix up something and put it on there and thinking, well, I can change it because it's oil. But that's foolish to just waste a lot of time that way.
Gene also, at that time, always had a few professional friends who were almost separated from us. He would go out painting with Jack Teeters. I think they must have painted for 35 years together, those two.
What do you feel someone like Gene has brought to the community as far as that is concerned?
Well, I believe that he's brought a great depth to the concept of what art really is and how it should be produced.
Is this satisfying for a teacher to watch what kids are doing? I mean, is there some creative satisfaction and reward in this kind of work?
Well, mainly because they're learning to observe, and they learn to use the instruments of recording, and occasionally if there's a critique going on, well, it might help them to grow in that way too.
One of the things that I've had people over periods of time ask, well, would you give private lessons and so on? And I never would, and I've always believed that really if you have a class, that the kids will get more out of it, or as much out of all the people around them, for inspiration, how to do it, the mistakes that I'm not going to make because I can see that wasn't the way to do it. You learn so much from all the people around you that are working. And you save so much time in a way. You don't have to make those mistakes or find those successful things to do or any of that. And then I think there's a satisfaction of just seeing people, because you're so interested in it yourself. I would assume that, if a good teacher would be, that it's satisfying to see what all these other hands are doing. I mean, what's coming out of their minds.
And Eugene has helped me considerably in suggesting the local color on this type of thing.
One of the things I always urge people to do is start looking at from the large shapes down to small. And if you're working with watercolor, which we were doing at the time, you'd be from light to dark. And usually doing sort of background coming towards the foreground. And one thing I always had people do was to look for the local color, and then, you'd obviously see the local color, but one of the things would be to look for all the other colors, because everybody knows there's going to be a lot of green grass or blue sky or whatever, but look for all the other colors that are there but you don't think about. Because it's too easy to just paint what you know, but not what you're looking at.
But I think one of the important things here is to remember the elements and principles of design. And if you are conscious of those things, it's easier to address the problem.
In art history, we always had assignments every few weeks. I remember, like every 6 weeks, you'd have to work out a project. But it was analyzing works of art, and you'd look at it for line and second and third dimension, flat forms and then forms and depth, texture and color and value, the amount of light and dark and various things, and then look for the abstract qualities or design, really, as you were just saying. Because in any good painting, whether it's the most realistic or the most abstract, there's usually a good, well, you can find a good abstract pattern or composition in the most realistic painting. And sometimes when there's hardly anything out and around, even I've done this a lot, to start looking up closely at something. It'd be almost the same as looking at something from an airplane and seeing a pattern on a landscape down here. And
Go ahead.
oh gosh, I'm wondering what I made him think of. But it might be like rock formations and things, just close-ups of things like that. And I can't do that fast enough always. I can always carry a camera because many things that I photograph, I'm not interested at all in painting. I want those as a composition, as a photograph.
Well, what I was thinking,
Yeah.
Eugene, was when we were out at the Applegate, at the Wayside Park, one day we had been painting, and you, as we walked back toward the car to put our things away, you spotted a little flower on the ground, and you dropped down to your knees. And you said, "I've got to make a drawing of that." And there he was, down on his hands and knees, doing this little, it was a very small flower, but it was very nice.
I'm not surprised.
It's nice with the clouds and picture of you on that.
I may take one of this right over through here. Okay, my stomach's in.
Good.
Have you got quite a bit, is there quite a bit of film on there?
Yeah, a lot of film.
Because I know there are other good spots that we are just a stone's throw from here.
I don't know whether you're going to get into or would rather avoid this issue, but I think it's certainly an important one, that this last year and this year have been hugely important in light of the vision disorder that has descended on Gene.
I think I was telling Vicki earlier today that that's the first indication. Andy Bucci was out here then, and I was driving him up to Ashland to see the retrospective at the Schneider Museum in 1994, and that was in July. and it was around 11:30 or so in the morning, and so we were headed towards south, to Ashland. And after a while, I just could hardly keep my eyes open. It just seemed so bright. And I said something to Andy, and it didn't seem to bother him that much. But it really concerned me. And of course, we got there and all, and you can always hold your eye open, which people do.
So it happened pretty suddenly.
Well, I think it had been coming on, but it never, you're not driving all the time, just once in a while. It was enough so that I thought this needs to be looked into. And so I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Vetzloff. After consulting with one of the other doctors there, told me he thought I should see a neurologist. And he told me several names, and Naris was the one that he seemed to like, and that's the one I made an appointment with. And he did a thorough examination, and then when that was over, he just said, you have blepharospasm.
It's it remains just a frightening thing. Again, when you're an artist, it's like a dancer who gets arthritis or something. It's a particularly poignant because you recognize not only the skill that is being wasted, but the body that's being wasted, and their whole career is in jeopardy. And I think that we've all had that reaction. But I've never heard him do that. He'll say, "Oh, it's a bad day," or "I can't stand the light," or "I've got to do this or that," or "I have this time for another treatment," or whatever. So he's been outspoken about it, but he's been very private about any of his own personal stress, and there must have been there.
Did she have the muscles cut again?
Yeah, they go in, and this was years back. In fact, the needles were much larger than they are now, and the Botox was very thick. See, now it's kind of like water in a way.
What's the Botox? What is that?
That's the material that they inject. It's botulinum, I believe is the pronunciation. But it's, botulism is really, it's fatal if you if you can some tomatoes and you haven't done it right, you can get this thing. Anyway, it sounded pretty awful, and it's very experimental. That is, they haven't been doing it long enough to know what the outcome will be. But they still prefer to have you go that route if medication won't do anything, than to have the surgery. And surgery is the last resort.
He has maintained a sense of balance and of humor in the light of this really wretched problem.
We want to welcome everyone to the 1999 Pioneer Day here in Jacksonville. The parade is going to kick off in about 12 or 13 minutes here. And when that happens, we're going to ask you to kind of vacate the street and make way for the parade. So that's in about 12 or 13 minutes. In the meantime, enjoy all the booths. There's going to be live music with Ambush from 1 to 4. And in the meantime, just enjoy yourself. And we'll let you know when you have to get out of the middle of the street.
It's very rare that towns of this quality survived. California is filled with ghost towns, mining town relics, you might say. But this is a town that reinvented itself from a gold rush town into a agricultural center. The same bankers who were banking gold banked farmers. And from here on out into the Rogue Valley was agricultural land, very rich agricultural land. But the fact that this ensemble still exists and people are living in it and using the buildings was what is unique, still unique. So Jacksonville was quite rare. I don't think the local people today even appreciate how rare it is.
The Queen's Trophy went to the color guard. Four straw action, and the Queen's Cross range. Children's Birthday by Miss Louise School of Dance. The second door. Emergency vehicle, oxygen firefighters. The building at Mercy Club.
Jacksonville didn't have any pride. The people who lived here thought they were living in a bad town, in a town that wasn't important. And that was true at that time. If you lived in Jacksonville, you couldn't charge anything in Medford. If you were a girl being married in a Jacksonville church, it would not be covered in the society page of the Medford paper. So this wasn't a good address. So there was a lot of work to be done to build up pride in community things. It didn't have a community life, and particularly tough because I was an outsider, Gene was an outsider. We were not part of these old timers.
What years were these? What time?
62. So we developed a Halloween party. We formed a boosters club. Then we had a Halloween party. We had Christmas light decorations, prizes. They gave prizes for those awards. We had an Easter egg hunt and all sorts of different things that began to draw the community together. As we moved along, Gene's values really emerged and there was a sense of color. Buildings had to be painted and what the color is going to be, what's the range of colors. And there were signs to be controlled and changed and reduced and made more appropriate and things. And his eye was tremendously helpful in helping people because he was nice and they trusted him. Things that people don't see, and streetscapes and trees and heights and widths and all the things that he does automatically. And he had that ability to give it a quality that didn't show. So you didn't want to paint it so that it showed, you wanted to paint it so it fit in. Or if you built, then you wanted things that were appropriate. And Gene had that eye, and he was a big value to the community of helping to help everybody else see their own town and see the quality in their own town. It particularly showed up when it came time to the U.S. Bank. The U.S. Hotel had been condemned, it was closed, you couldn't even enter it. But we persuaded the U.S. Bank to put a branch in that lower corner of the building. But the bank formed a sort of a design committee that included the head of the Oregon Historical Society, the head of our museum here, Gene Bennett, Stu Kidd, who was their interior designer, Walt Pappas, who was the architect. Those 5 people set the style for the little bank building and for the hotel restoration. And Gene did all the graphics, the sign up above, all the checks that were printed, especially checks for them. He painted the small old picture on the safe for them, and all the filigree work, so it looked old. But it's a Jacksonville scene, which he was not original to him. He copied an earlier drawing, but made it look old. It's a lovely thing, just by standalone by itself. So his eye, again, was drawn in all the way through that bank. And that committee picked the light fixtures and the chairs and the color codes and the wallpaper texture and everything about it. And Gene was the only real professional eye on that particular committee. And so he had a big impact in that kind of a thing. But they spent very, very heavily. They created a beautiful product, which they could be proud of, and a product that set a whole new quality for this community, a whole new tone. And nicely, it wasn't like a rich man came in and built a rich house. It was a commercial company. Tough old, grubby, stingy bankers built an absolutely beautiful room. So it was the nice thing. Everybody had to respect it. And it was not arrogant or anything like that in the community. It was a contribution to the community. And soon after that, quickly, the post office department wanted to build here, And when we said, well, we don't like your plans, we want to build a better one, they said, okay, come on, help us. So the outside of that post office is our design on top of a very ordinary square pumice stone federal building. But they were willing to let it give us the front to change and that sort of thing. And then the telephone company, they didn't want any fights. They wanted the best building they could get for their money's worth. And so they built a very beautiful building. They hired a great architect and, you know, all this stuff. So we had big corporate Oregon coming in here, following the U.S. Bank's lead and making some very serious contributions to this town. So he's had a strong influence in the community.
The first time I ever saw an art show was, as such, was a group of things brought down from the University of Oregon, and it was shown in the auditorium of the courthouse. And they didn't allow any nails or anything, and so they had folding chairs, and they put the things on the chairs or on the floor, leaning against the wall. I mean, that was an art exhibit.
The Rogue Gallery in Medford has been the hub of the art community for as long as I can remember. And over the years, a lot of galleries have come and gone. It's very difficult to keep a gallery in operation just because it doesn't really generate an income.
The Rogue Gallery was 100% Gene's idea. He thought it ought to happen in the community. He thought the community ought to have a place where local community artists could show. It was that simple.
Jack Teeters and Betty Allen. I think the four of us were maybe the first four that met, and I think it was at Gene's inducement that the four of us came together.
Then it grew rather quickly. They said, okay, now we're going to grow. And they created the Rogue Valley Art Association, and with a board. But they were the sort of the formation committee, and then it really got started with the Rogue Valley Art Association.
All the time that I was having classes every summer when I would come out here, and I did that for a number of years. And when we finally formed, there was quite a few, the nucleus, I would say a lot of it was from the people who had been in those classes.
And then they became the membership committee once we started the gallery.
Right.
The Rogue Gallery was a sort of a funny notion to us, you know, based on the Rogues Gallery, the famous Rogues Gallery. And we decided that we did like that we would be the Rogue Valley Art Association.
The gallery was dedicated to bringing into the valley art from beyond the valley.
That was really what we talked about a lot, was we wanted to, we should see other things. All we were seeing here, and not under good conditions, I mean no facility for it, were these things of Crater Lake and so on, that countless paintings of Crater Lake, I remember when I first came back.
From Eugene's early meetings, there was an emphasis that the gallery was never going to be a museum or a point of collection, but rather a place for exhibition of current work. And so I remember a phrase that was in some of that early paperwork talking about the art of our time and place, and that has continued, and that's a sort of a unique position in terms of the valley. And we do have a very minimal collection of just probably under 20 items.
And you say you don't have anything in the rack or anything here right now?
He doesn't. I have him Jackson, I call him at home and he brings them.
Oh, that's good.
Yes.
That's good. Well, nice to have a personal representative.
Yeah, whatever style works.
As the gallery has continued over these years, the notion of community and what our time and place is has broadened, so that we have had Hmong tapestries and Egyptian children's woven rugs, and we still think of that as being our time and place.
I felt it was nice to have an organization that would bring in exhibits, and we were also interested in, if possible, a place to have classes. And that was something that they started doing from the beginning too.
Is that when you're student? Oh yeah.
Did you do that one?
I did these too.
What is the technique on the left top one?
On this one?
Yeah, is that just watercolor?
It's just watercolor and a toothbrush trick.
Toothbrush trick? What's that?
A toothbrush trick is when you dip the toothbrush in paint and you take it and you just like splatter paint on it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get down to the base, then you're going to start breaking and coming in. So you don't want to go across the base. You want to stop at the edge of the mask, but all the way down, across, okay? So let's watch Lily. She's pretty good at the wash, doing a background wash now.
Up until this year, we have probably had between 18 and 20,000 visitors a year. And I would say with Eugene's exhibit last year that we had actually over 3,000 people in the gallery the month that, or 6 weeks that his work was up. And we've done almost as well since the whole cloth project has begun. So I would suspect that our attendance at the end of this year will probably be close to 22,000 people.
At about the time of the election, just before, a very dear friend of ours, Walt Pappas, died of a brain tumor. And a couple weeks later, a month or so later, Gene had a show at the Rogue Gallery, and in it was a stunning painting which won me totally. And I called him the next morning and said, I don't know why, but that painting, Forgotten Garden, wraps up for me those terrible weeks of Walt's death. And he said, I'm so glad that it meant something to someone else, because he couldn't bear to go to the funeral and had gone instead to the Jacksonville Cemetery and painted wild roses against a tangle of greens. It's a painting I'd love to have you. I have that painting. I'm lucky enough to have that painting, and I'd love to have you see it.
Did you go out painting with Gene? Out into the wilderness or outdoors?
Not really. I don't remember.
Well, I think the closest we came to it were the bachelor picnics.
Oh, yes.
Ray and Bill Hitch and then Aunt Alice and Bill's sister, and we would invite some of the women, but we always call it the annual bachelor picnic, and we
Yes.
usually go up on the Applegate.
And we'd paint and
Yeah.
draw.
A lot of fun, but we're about the only ones left from that.
I know it. I mean, they died like flies.
Well, we got them underground right away, so.
No, I think so often of those people. And I miss them.
Oh, I do too.
That whole group, that whole bunch.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed kind of unfair in a way that suddenly just so many people dropped off.
Yeah.
Well, we're the hangers-on, so to speak, I guess.
Yes, hang in there.
toe. This is your chance to get other people, you know.
We got some great shots.
Oh, have you?
The show really does look fantastic.
It is good, isn't it?
It's really Bob's stuff looks great.
It does, yeah. Well, I think it's so neat. That's what I was talking about. See, those are similar size, well, 3 of them and that other. But it makes such a neat presentation. And then see the same thing with Jack's over there.
Jack is here.
Yeah. I saw him as soon as I came in the door.
Well, thank you all for coming today. It's wonderful to see such a wonderful turnout. And, you know, we're celebrating the lives and the work and the artistic work of these fabulous 4 people. We're here because they started this, they had the vision 40 years ago to, you know, put this together. And I'm going to have a few of them speak.
I came here in 1957, and I met Eugene. He knew the key people, and very shortly after the 4 of us had the initial meeting, we had a second meeting, and there were about 15 or 20 people. Very shortly we had funds to open a space which needed some renovating, but we were able to borrow equipment, and with volunteers we were able to do quite a lot in a very short time.
I remember Mother starting her sculpture in the laundry room, right next to the washer and dryer, and the extreme focus on her face as she just worked that clay with her thumbs. And I have wonderful memories, as does Kathy, of incredible people coming to our house. The artistry was shown not only in the medium we see, but in food and drink, laughter. Mom and Dad were well known for having musicals, and everyone who came had to do some kind of performance, including, I think, Eugene Bennett played the comb once.
When Mother started doing this in this laundry room, and then she started painting, and we were meeting all these people coming and going, and then there were classes and so on, and then there was the opening of the gallery there. Probably, I think, some of the richest, most beautiful work she did in the last 4 years of her life. When she was struggling with cancer, it brought out color and form and experimentation. And it's wonderful to come here today to realize how special and different it was, and to see people recognized who did it because it was their passion and the right thing to do.
Bob sends
through me, he said he just wanted to be here, but he couldn't. And so I want to thank you all for participating and supporting the gallery. He's had a wonderful life painting and architecture. I grew up watching him paint all kinds of things on the wall, in the bathtub, wherever he could paint. Our home was an artistic gallery. So this is a wonderful tribute to Bob and the other group that put this together, and I'm really appreciative of the people that are supportive of art here in Medford.
And last we certainly have Eugene Bennett here, and I'd like to ask him to come up and say a few words just about the early days, the beginnings. Actually, he's the founder of all of this, and that's ultimately why we're back here together.
Should I start with the wagon train? Well, it's almost everything's been said now, but I think when Jack said the key people, I want you to know that this would be everybody from students who were in the classes or the kids whose parents were sending them to the children's classes. Everybody, that it was, you know, and unfortunately there were some people who could afford to do much more, who did more, but it was efforts of all. Well, thanks to everybody for coming, and to all the people over all the years that have helped to get it where it is, and I hope it'll keep going and we'll all get together in another 40 years.
There are some sort of summary comments about Gene that are kind of important, probably. I think one thing that is quite distinguished is the fact that he's always had a goal, which he achieved, to have his own studio and do his own selling in a professional way. And you know where he is right now, where he lives, he's got an exhibition gallery, he's got a work gallery, he's got a storeroom out in the garage, and that's almost the dream of every artist in the world. If journalists dream of owning a small town newspaper and being their own boss, probably for artists the ability to have a place to live, a studio where they can work, and some space around them where they can be themselves, you might say, is the dream. People go into lofts in New York and different places, but I think Gene has achieved what would be the dream of practically every professional artist as he goes up her career. Looking back on his life, I think he would have to feel, and I think anybody who observes it would feel, that he really achieved his goals in a very distinguished way. I've used the word about him that he's a loner, and I mean it, and I mean it in the best sense. But I think certainly, as he would see himself towards the end of his life, he's been surrounded by people who loved him, and it's been the reverse. I don't know anybody who doesn't like Gene Bennett, because he seems to like everybody that he meets. He's a very friendly person without sort of an overt graciousness. It's an ease that he has that is just part of his whole total image. And I think he's done it all, and certainly done it by himself. But he has always been liked, and liked not just for his work, but he's been liked because he's contributed back to the community. And that's always been respected. And I think, you know, those are sort of nice achievements in a lifetime.